مرحبا وأهلا بكم في برنامج داخل واشنطن. معكم مضيفكم روبرت ساتلوف. الموازنة بطرق كثيرة. وضع الموازنة هو أهم مهام الحكومة. دونها لا يمكن للحكومة إداء أملها. دونها لا يمكن أن تشن الجيوش الهروب، ولا يمكن أن تفتح المستشفيات أبوابها، ولا يمكن أن تعلم المدارس طلابها. دونها ليست للحكومة أولويات، إنها مبالغ طائلة من المال، حوالي 7 تريليون دولار، أي ما يزيد من 10 أضعاف اقتصاد المملكة العربية السعودية بأكمله. وهذا هو السبب في أن المعركة التشريعية بشأن الموازنة هي عادة أهم معركة سياسية خلال العام. أصدرت إدارة بايدن مؤخرا موازنتها المقترحة، بما تنبئنا عن الأولويات الرئيس. هل الديمقراطيون متحدون أم منقسمون حول أولويات الإنفاق؟ كيف يستجيب الجمهوريون لخطط الرئيس؟ لمناقشة سياسات الموازنة الفيدرالية في إدارة بايدن، يسرني أن أرحب بالخبيرين المتميزين في سياسات واشنطن، ستيف كليمنز وجيمس أستل. Welcome back to Dakhel, Washington. The federal budget. Some see this as the driest of topics. I disagree. I think it's one of the most important topics in American politics and the American economy. And so we're going to focus on this issue. I'm delighted to have Steve Clemens and James Astil to delve into the important issue of the federal budget. So Steve, let's start at the beginning. How big is our budget and what role does it play, generally speaking, in the American economy?
Well, Rob, right now, the U.S. government budget, I just did a quick, look at it. It has grown from where it used to be between $4 and $5 trillion to now $6.5 trillion in total. And the overall GDP of the United States is just $21 trillion. So you can do the math. It is an enormous part and portion of the overall economic activity in the United States. And a lot of private sector investment and private sector consumer activity and investment in the country tracks along with the decisions and priorities of that federal budget and the priorities expressed. So it is very, very significant for the United States.
Who is responsible in our system for making the budget, for reviewing it, for approving it, and for spending it? James?
So there's a sort of political notion that the president is responsible because there's a large sort of headline news story when the White House proposes a budget, drafts a budget in support of its notional policy plans. In fact, it's squarely Congress's responsibility to draw up and approve spending plans, which it then hands to the White House, which in turn delegates responsibility for spending that money to its various agencies. And we're right in the middle of that process right now. Joe Biden has proposed a very, very expansive $6 trillion budget, even after a crisis which has involved an historic fiscal expansion. And now the Democrats' extraordinarily slender majority in Congress is trying to argue for those plans with some dwindling degree of success, I would say.
We used to talk about, $1 million here, $1 million there. Eventually you're talking about real money. We're talking trillions of dollars. These are enormous sums. How does an administration figure out how to reflect its priorities in the budgeting process? Steve?
Well, a lot of players come in, and it's sort of like a souffle. When you cook a souffle, there are a lot of parts of that souffle, and eventually when you take it out of the oven, it rises right at the moment. But before that, it looks like a real mess. And that's essentially the budget definition process, where every agency of government is responsible for cobbling together, trying to understand what the president lays out as his or her priorities, and then that budget gets executed. And within the administration, when they're putting together, folks make claims, and then it goes through a process that the White House controls. You know, the Office of Management and Budget in the White House kind of looks at processes, integrates these things, and also, you know, rolls back some of the requests. So maybe the Pentagon, which is one of the largest parts of the federal budget, you know, will have parts of its priorities pared down. It goes through that process in the White House. But as James just said, the president kind of lays out saying, here is the playground I'd like to have. Here's where my parking lot stripes are going to be, and where I want to, you know, give, you know, a certain amount of room to different people coming into this parking lot. I'm just using this as a metaphor. But those lines get moved around by the political process in the legislative branch. And that is where, and remember, we're only talking about budgetary outlines, and that means authorizations eventually to spending money. Spending money is actually a very different equation. That's where you get appropriations, and that's a whole different set of players. So you have an enormous number of people negotiating in what is like a contact sport, like soccer, you know, with different teams coming in and competing over priorities. And eventually it will rise in a souffle. But the process all along is chaotic. It is not neat and orderly, and there are some real surprises along the way.
And Rob, can I just chip into that bit? Because there's something sort of unprecedented happening right now. What Steve is describing there very beautifully is sort of, you know, the blood sport of the budgeting process, and the way that the administration and Congress and all the various interests that surround them fight it out to get their priorities into the budget in a sort of traditional recognizable form. What's happening now is that because the regular business of legislating has become so dysfunctional, spending is the single great way that an administration gets to signal its priorities. It cannot pass sort of, you know, reforming legislation in the traditional fashion. Rather, therefore, it proposes in a very crude political sense to spend money, to throw money at problems. And therefore, I would suggest that sort of calculating process, you know, what do we need, what will it cost, what can we ask for, what's politically possible to ask for, has become rather crude and untested. We're in untested waters, and the size of the Biden administration's ask of Congress, those $6 trillion after an historic fiscal expansion, is proof perfect of that. It's asking for hundreds of billions of dollars for clean energy spending, which it's hard to do a sort of sensible calculation, to understand in a very sensible way. These are notional asks which signal political priorities almost as much as they are, I think, sort of pencil line, carefully worked out calculations of what the government needs and can spend.
Steve, what do you think about that?
Our debt to GDP ratio is going through the roof. Before Barack Obama, President Obama came into office, before the 2008-2009 financial crisis and the major bailouts the U.S. economy needed, our debt to GDP ratio was, government debt to GDP ratio was about 80-90%. It's now at about 160%. We've seen a doubling. Debt to GDP is a very important measure because it shows real change over time in the proportions of these things. And now we have, just to take infrastructure for a moment, and a piece of legislation that looks at the level of investment that we may be making in the broad infrastructure of the United States that hopefully creates recurring returns for the economy without recurring investment. But Bernie Sanders is looking at, an expansive idea of another $6 trillion. Most people are giving. So there is a gravity-less dimension right now, which you would add that to what James said, makes this a very, very unusual moment in American, budget and debt history.
Actually, so let me just take a moment to put this in a bit of context. When was the last time America did not run a deficit? If memory serves me, it was back in the Clinton administration. Is that right? And it's been...
Yeah, I mean, just very quickly, Bill Clinton came in, but a lot of things conspired to help that, which was essentially the IT boom had created rushes of revenue from essentially people's stock transactions, both at the state and local level, but also the federal level. And the government was able to discipline it enough because there was a senator in the Senate Budget Committee a Republican, Pete Domenici, who really cared about balancing the budget. And Domenici and Clinton and the others who were around were able to discipline the spending process. But that's the last time we had a balanced budget.
So, but is it fair to say that if it's been 20 years or so since we've had a balanced budget, is it fair to say that that there's Republican and Democratic hands involved in this explosion of federal spending?
Most certainly. There has been a kind of familiar pattern in recent political cycles where Republicans worry about deficit spending and the total debt immensely when in opposition, and then spend in equivalent terms to the Democrats when in office. They have different priorities by and large. They're less worried about social welfare spending, are keener to throw ever more largesse at the Department of Defense, but their deficits are absolutely comparable to the Democrats, and indeed, I think on a sort of historic basis, they may be larger. And Donald Trump, to a degree, sort of blew that that sort of I hesitate to use the word hypocritical, but plainly contradictory political pattern where the Republicans pretended to worry about deficits in opposition, actually didn't in government, sort of out of the water by explicitly saying that he didn't care about deficits and debt. He did on occasion, but he said a lot of contradictory things. But he moved the priorities of the Republican Party off small government fiscal concerns altogether. And it is now not where the center of concern, the center of gravity in the Republican Party is at all. And that is a new dynamic also, in addition to those that we've already discussed, whereby you have a Democratic president asking for enormous sums of money, and he has champions, including the chairman of the Budget Committee in the Senate, who is keen to give him even greater sums of money. And though you have some Republicans sort of adhering to the traditional dance, say, well, actually, we're gravely worried about the national debt, and the Democratic president should not be asking for such sums. By and large, that's not the main preoccupation of the Republican Party anymore. And indeed, polling of Republican voters suggests that they're pretty much as relaxed or as keen on much of this spending as Democratic voters.
I mean, James has said something so important, and I just want to punctuate it, that we have neither political party in the United States right now has made its chief obsession fiscal responsibility, not the Republicans nor the Democrats. And so you have a situation that I think will eventually be, to again say, punctuated by a crisis of overspending. We're beginning to look at inflation and the kind of questions of what we're cooking up. Donald Trump came in and spent a lot of money, and he cut revenue to the government. He cut taxes, and so he created this at a time when the U.S. economy didn't need to do that. But look at the last 20 years, Rob. You had three huge crises. You had, 9/11. You had the terrorist attacks on New York and Washington, D.C., and the responses and the wars that came after that. You had the 2008-2009 financial crisis, which was a global economic crisis with incredible systemic impacts on the livelihoods and quality of life of many Americans. And then we had COVID. So you had crises come along about every 8-9 years that were big shocks that needed that spending.
We're going to take a break here. But before I go, I urge all of our viewers, don't follow the federal government's advice in balancing your own checkbook. Please. We'll come back to discuss more about the federal budget in just a moment. Infrastructure is not a sexy or exciting word, but the possibility of reaching a deal on infrastructure might give President Biden one of the biggest victories of his administration. This is not the first presidential focus on infrastructure. In fact, it has been at the center of American history for more than 200 years. Let's take a moment to remember three huge innovations in American infrastructure that transformed our country at critical moments in our history. The first leap was the Erie Canal, a massive structure built in the first quarter of the 19th century, nearly 600 kilometers long, that connected the Great Lakes in the center of America with New York City and the Atlantic Ocean. The second was the Transcontinental Railroad, which in 1869 connected the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads and made it possible to travel from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific. The third, about 85 years later, was the Interstate Highway System, created in the Eisenhower administration, which built a massive system of roads that made it possible for every American in his or her own car to travel to virtually every corner of the continental 48 states. Every generation has its infrastructure challenge. Ours may be to create another highway, the broadband highway, to spread access and opportunity across our country. If this gets approved and executed, it may just be Joe Biden's greatest legacy. Again, our guests today include Steve Clemens. Steve is editor-at-large for The Hill, a newspaper focused on U.S. politics, Congress, and Capitol Hill. He's also senior fellow and founder of the American Strategy Program at the New America Foundation, a prominent Washington think tank. Steve has served as Washington editor-at-large for The Atlantic, vice president of the Economic Strategy Institute, which is obvious from today's conversation, and executive director of the Nixon Center for Peace and Freedom. Also joining us is James Astill. James is the Washington bureau chief and Lexington columnist at The Economist. He's covered American politics for more than 5 years. Previously, he served as The Economist's South Asia bureau chief based in Delhi, the energy and environment editor, and the political editor. And to his great credit, James is the author of an award-winning book on India and cricket. All right, gentlemen, we've been focusing so far this conversation on one half of a budget, but everybody who manages their own family knows that there are two parts to a budget, revenue and expenditure. Let's talk for a moment about revenue. How does the federal budget get its revenue? And does it, and tell me about the IRS debate, rather odd debate about the Internal Revenue Service, which we're having this year in American politics. James?
I'd much rather you gave the wonkish stuff to Steve, Rob, but I mean, I'll have a go if you want. Go on, let Steve do it. He's much better on the process.
All right, Steve.
No, I mean, well, I would tell you what's a really fascinating thing about the budgetary process and what we call, the budget, the appropriations process, is it's largely disconnected from the revenue process. It's crazy. But overall, it's the responsibility of the White House and the president's cabinet to try to align, budget and where the president is going over many, many years ahead. But the revenue process is a nearer term issue where you've got to bring, look at tax policy and how you're bringing in revenue, both from individuals and corporations, how that burden is shared, and then how that overall package is stacked globally. We sit in a global context. So, particularly firms, we've had a lot of talk about this. But one of the interesting things about the Biden administration right now and the taxes, they've kind of built into their budget this notion that they're going to go reclaim through the IRS tens and hundreds of billions of dollars of tax cheaters, very rich people that have been cheating on their taxes for a long time. And so to reclaim that, to bring that in is a way that they're trying to score, what we call score, which is to sort of look at how you align where the president wants to go in terms of budget and how you align the anticipated income, meaning tax revenue that comes in. And so it's highly unusual that they're coming in with a budget line or an income revenue line about, catching cheaters and bringing in a vast amount of money. So that's part of the equation.
James, to one of your earlier points about how Republicans seem to have dropped their traditional philosophy. They used to be the party that would target waste, fraud, and abuse in the government. And one would think that they would support expanding the IRS to get at all this abuse, but they're actually opposing going after people who aren't paying their taxes. Is that
This is the absolute. It's utterly bizarre. And this is the strangeness to which you intimated in your question, to which you referred in your question, Rob. On the one hand, it's true that tax cheating has become the sort of left-wing version of waste, fraud, and abuse on the right.
I'm very sorry that we have to cut this short, that we've run out of time. This is a terrific discussion, very important, has ramifications that go on decades down the road. I'm delighted. Thank you very much, James and Steve, for joining us on Dakhel, Washington. When I was 11 years old, in 5th grade, my teacher gave our class an assignment I will never forget. Prepare a budget, she said, for something everyone has that is even more valuable than money. It was a riddle. Budgets were always about money, I thought. How do you budget anything else? I was a very good student, but this assignment stumped me. When I came to school on Monday morning, I remember I was embarrassed not to have figured it out. And to this day, I'll never forget the lesson. Our teacher wanted us to budget our time, an asset that, once spent, can never be regained. Quite unlike money, which you can always recoup if you're smart or lucky enough. Time was more valuable than money, she was trying to teach us, one of the most valuable lessons of my childhood. I think of my 5th grade teacher every year when the federal budget hits the front page. This is a huge bill, trillions of dollars, that reflects both the priorities of the president and the wheeling and dealing needed to get the budget bill passed by Congress. Unlike a budget of time, which always has 24 hours in a day, 7 days in a week, and 365 days in a year, the input and the output are both variables, revenue and expenditure. Indeed, arguments over revenue, that is taxes, are often louder and more heated than arguments over spending. This year, that argument is, in my view, approaching absurdity, as the two parties are now caught in a fight over whether to spend enough money to collect all the taxes currently owed under Republican-approved tax laws, not even to raise taxes to cover the amount of added spending the president and his Democratic Party want to approve. The real fight is coming over spending. Lots of spending. Trillions of dollars in infrastructure. Physical, airports, roads, bridges. Technical, a huge expansion of broadband. And human, such as childcare and elder care. Not only would such spending amount to a dramatic change in the role of government, but it's a long-standing American tradition that once social spending is approved, it almost never gets terminated. Sometimes the line items get reduced, but they rarely get zeroed out. So decisions now will have repercussions for many, many years to come. That's why the budget is so important. It's not a dry issue, important only to policy wonks and government accountants. It affects every American, and in some ways, every person in the world. So watch this space and follow the debate over the budget like you would follow the World Cup. It's really that important. بهذا نصل لنهاية هذه الحلقة من برنامج داخل واشنطن. إذا كانت لديكم أي استفسارات أو تعليقات حول هذه الحلقة، وخاصة حول المعركة السياسية بشأن الموازنة الفيدرالية، أرجو أن تتواصلوا معي عبر تويتر على هاشتاغ Inside Washington أو أن تراسلوني مباشرة على @RobSatloff. سأراكم الأسبوع المقبل، وإلى أن ألقاكم شكرا لكم وإلى اللقاء.